To import a layer, you can use these icons. The easiest way to import a layer, though, is just to drag and drop it in right into the window. So on Dropbox, I have all the files for today's demo. I'm going to start by importing the world poly layer, and this is a shape file that has all the countries in the world, so we can start looking at the kind of biggest scale of this. So shape files are an ArcGIS standard. They work really well with QGIS, so I usually use those. The weird thing about shape files is every piece of that file is saved as a different file with different extensions. So a shape file typically comes in as somewhere between 4 and 7 different files. The .shp is the main file. That's what you actually use. All these files are kind of, you need them, and they do different things. Like the projection system is specified by one file. The DBF is the actual database that has the data in it. And the shape file, which has the geographic information and the geometry, is linked to the DBF, which has the database of data. Okay. You don't have to worry about it too much. Just try to keep them together. If you're moving these things between different folders, just keep everything together. If you want to bring in a shapefile, this is the file you work with. So what I'm going to do first is basically just click, drag on a shapefile, and plop it into the window. Alternatively, you can go to, I think this is Add Vector Layer, and then browse for your file using that dialog box. But as with most things, it's usually easier to just drag and drop it in. Okay, so this is the world. This is the projected version. You guys know about this. When you get to the size of the world, the projection really matters, right? Because the way that you peel that orange or whatever people use to demonstrate it and flatten it out really affects the relative sizes and shapes of the countries, right? So here you can see a standard geographic projection. This is similar to what Google uses. Here the layer is written in your layers tab, and this is the way that you start to work with these different layers and give them different representation styles here. Cool. So to edit the display of the layer, so right now it's a green fill with this kind of black stroke, you can double click on the representation here. So you see here a green square showing you a little preview of that. That will take you to the layer properties window. You can also find that window by right clicking on the layer, and here you have a lot of options for that layer, and you can go to properties. You can also just double click on the name of the layer and it'll take you to the properties. Alright, so in this properties window, the first tab, general, gives you the path to the shapefile. This is another way that GIS is different from other drafting software. In things like AutoCAD, there's an idea of blocks where you're actually referencing files. You're not working with the file directly, it's always referenced from another file. This is the only way that GIS works. You're never making stuff in the software. You're always just referencing the file. So GIS will let you edit the layer, but it's always referencing something on your system. So when you save changes, it saves it back to the original layer. When you save a GIS file, all it saves is the composition of layers and all the styles. The data is always referenced from the shapefile. Okay, so this will give you a link to where that shapefile is. And this is really important. This is the coordinate reference system. This is the projection system that's tied to that layer. So every shapefile also has specifications for what kind of projection system it uses. In this case, we're using WGS84. For the purposes of this class, we're only going to deal with a couple different projection systems to keep it really straightforward. In the real world, or maybe even in your studios, when you get a piece of data, you start working with some part of the world, they might tell you what projection system they prefer. But in this case, for a geographic system, this is going to be our base, okay? But we'll come back to coordinate systems in a little bit. The next tab is style. This has all of the functions for how that layer is visualized. So the very simplest way to visualize a piece of geometry is just with single symbol, and it just uses one style for every piece of geometry. Okay, so in this case, we can start to change the color. Maybe I'll set this to no color, and I can give it a different color stroke if I wanted to. Okay, and you can kind of apply and preview it here. So it's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, and then there's a bunch of other options. The one that comes up a lot is labels. If you want to label pieces of geometry in your map, you can select this, and then you just have to specify which field of the data that label sits in. Okay, so here if you drop this down, it'll show you all the data that a shapefile contains, and one of them is name, so you can start to give labels to things. So that's basic layer settings. So like I mentioned, the GIS, all the information in GIS is always, there's always two parts to it. There's the geographic geometry, so all these lines defining the boundaries of the countries. That's one side of the GIS file, and the other one is all the data that comes along with it. So if you right-click on any layer and go to Open Attribute Table, this is the data set that's tied to those shapes. So for every single shape, let's see if I can get one of these. For instance, if we select the US, okay, so this is selected here, it will also select that shape in here. Here it is, and it's the US, okay? So this is important to understand the intrinsic kind of connection or tie between the geography and the data. They're always connected. If you do something here, you're actually working on the same shape. There's just kind of a front of house and back of house to those things, okay? And you can see here, this is pretty basic kind of table format. Every row is a feature, so these are literally all the shapes in your shapefile. And then you can have any number of columns with different types of data. The first few columns generally are mandatory fields containing geographic information like area or location. And then you can have any number of these fields. You can create your own to store data with these objects. Okay, so here, for instance, we have the name and the region, the part of the world that it's in. Okay, and then the final thing I'll say about shapefiles, and this is pretty standard with all GIS type files, is that they come basically in three flavors, three types of shapefiles for three different types of geometry. There's point files, which the features are just points, locations, and space. There's line files, which can just only be polylines. And there's polygon file type, which contains shapes. And you have to specify the type of file when you create it, and you can only have geometry of that type in here. Okay, so that's another way that's different from a drawing program. This is really the geography and the shapes are just ways of storing data. You have to decide, at the very beginning, what type of data you'll use. So for things like countries where you want a defined area of the world, you use polygons. So this is what this file type that's used for this shapefile. For things like borders or edges, so say like a water border or roads or rivers, you typically use a polyline because it's not so important the width of those things, particularly for roads. It's only important the actual route of that path. Okay, so for different path type things, you'd use a line. And for just locating things like on a world scale, cities possibly, or store locations or things like this, you'd use a point type. And we're going to use all three of those types today.